There's nothing left to build. It is finished. The ancient might reply, well, no one's living in it. It's not a home. All you have is a house. And after some dialogue, the construction worker from the future, puts a bed in a house, and he puts some lamps in to light the place after dark. And then the ancient comes in one night. He looks around and he says, oh, now you've finished creating the home. So it could be that Job 38 is the house story and Genesis 1 is the home story. And then somebody once said, people read the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Well, when it comes to creation, oftentimes people read the Bible in one hand and a science textbook in the other.
Hello, everyone. Once again, today we're talking with Evan Minton of Cerebral Faith. We're going to be talking about a critique of John Walton's view of Genesis 1 as immaterial origins. Just a reminder, our goal is to clarify what John Walton's views are, if there's any issues with that, as well as give additional arguments for why we see the critique, but we also still take John Walton's view anyways. You can check out any of our other videos if you want an extended summary of Walton's view. But Evan, could you give us a very, very short summary of Walton's view as far as Genesis 1 goes?
Yeah, Walton's view is what is called what I call a non-concordist view, whereas a concordist view would be like Ken Ham, young Earth creationist stuff, but also you have old Earthers who hold concordist views, like those at Reasons to Believe, and I like to call it the approach. I borrowed this illustration from eschatology, which deals with the end of the world, not the beginning of the world, where you have like. Somebody once said, people read the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Well, when it comes to creation, oftentimes people read the Bible in one hand and a science textbook in the other. And Walton says that's a wrong approach. Don't do that. That's reading modern science, modern ideas into the text. It's not reading the text as the original author and audience would have understood it. And so Walton looks at ancient Near Eastern creation myths and texts and tries to get into their mindset, or as my hermeneutics teacher at a church in Easley said, you want to step into the sandals of the author. And he looks at these ancient Near Eastern creation texts, he looks at Genesis 1, he looks at the original languages, and eventually he makes his arguments, and his conclusion is that Genesis 1 is not about material origins, God manufacturing stuff that didn't previously have material being. Rather, God is assigning functions to everything over a 7-day period, and he does take the 7 days as literal 24-hour days, not long ages like a Hugh Ross would. And what God is doing when he is assigning functions to plants and animals and the sun, moon, and stars and so on throughout the 7 days is he's inaugurating the universe. He's preparing the universe to dwell in and to dwell with his people. It's to basically make the universe as his temple. That's why it is often referred to as the cosmic temple inauguration view.
Cool, great summary there. And so let's go on to their paper here. This is David Toshio Tsumura's paper critique of John Walton's view, and he is a professor. He's a professor at Japan Bible Seminary. I like this paper. It's actually quite short. It's only like 2 pages long, but made some interesting points here for sure. He kind of starts the paper off by talking about how something along the lines of Walton maybe misquoted or misunderstood Dr. Tsumura's views on this one specific part of Tehu Bahu and how the Genesis 1 creation starts. But we'll kind of skip over that, as I'm not really interested in whether he misquoted him or not. But on the other hand, he made some interesting points here. First of all, he says, though Walton warns us not to impose our modern cognitive environment on ancient texts, he overemphasizes the distinction between material ontology and functional ontology. He says that Genesis 1 was an account not of material, but of the ordering of the cosmos by initiating functions. However, there are passages in the Bible, such as Amos 4:13, Job 38 FF, etc., where the material ontology is a primary interest. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, Amos 4:13. That verse is a weak argument because it's basically just a blank statement that says God created the mountains and the winds. Its primary purpose is to exalt the greatness of Yahweh, and the nature of how these things were created. It's ambiguous. It doesn't really lend itself to either a material or a functional origins view, because it's just a blank assertion that God created the mountains and the winds. Now, Job 38 is interesting. The way it's worded, it does make me think that material manufacturing is in view here, because some of the language is reminiscent of the building of the Jerusalem temple in First Kings. For example, laying the foundations. First Kings talks about laying the foundations of the temple, and God talks about laying the foundations of the earth in Job 38. But this shouldn't bother the one who holds to the Waltonian interpretation, because Walton himself agrees that the Israelites believed God was responsible for the material manufacturing of the cosmos, in addition to installing the functions. The Israelites didn't believe that Yahweh and matter were co-eternal, that the world just always existed but didn't have a purpose until God said, I'm going to give it a purpose. Um, so the question, though, is, does the presence of material alone mean that the world exists? Once the material is present, do you have existence? If even if you don't have a function present? So if the foundations of the earth were laid, but it didn't have a function yet, it might be, in the ancient Near Eastern understanding, like a temple where you have all the bricks piled up on top of each other, and it has physical form, but it's not open for business yet. There's no rituals and worship and stuff, so it's not functioning as a temple. It's not a temple. It's just a building. Um, so even if Yahweh, and he's the one doing the talking in this passage, even if he is referring to when he put the world together, which is something the Israelites presupposed, it doesn't really answer the question of whether or not material form was a sufficient condition for existence. So, in other words, Job 38 and Genesis 1 may be speaking of two sides of the same coin. Genesis 1 is focusing on functions, and functions are logically posterior to material form, whereas Job 38 to 40 is functioning on the material manufacturing of the cosmos, which is both chronologically and logically prior to everything having a function. If Walton is right, then for God to merely bring things into physical existence wouldn't be enough for, in the A&E mindset, it wouldn't be enough for A&E peoples to say, yes, now it exists. Depending on how far back Genesis 1's oral tradition goes, they may have just assumed that after the bringing the world into material form, God went on to give things functions and thus truly brought them into being. And like Noah Weeks and Jacques B. Ducan, which we've looked at in previous videos, it's no strike against the functional origins view if the ancients knew that things could not have material form and then be manufactured to have material form. What would be a strike against the view is if we have good evidence that uh, that something is materially manufactured, and then it's considered, okay, we have the material, now it exists. I think a good word picture to get this point across would be to, if you imagine a construction worker, maybe he gets in a time machine, he goes back to the year 3000 BC. Suppose he takes some wood from a tree and he makes a cabin, but it's empty, it doesn't have furniture, and no one's living in it. Now, an ancient might come along and ask the worker, well, aren't you going to finish creating the home? The building is, from a material ontology, already finished. And the hypothetical ancient's question might baffle our hypothetical time-traveling construction worker. And he might be like, what are you talking about? There's nothing left to build. It is finished. But the ancient might reply, well, no one's living in it. It's not a home. All you have is a house. And after some dialogue, the construction worker from the future, puts a bed in a house and he puts some lamps in to light the place after dark. And then the ancient comes in one night, he looks around and he says, "Oh, now you've finished creating the home." Notice that this hypothetical ancient's question presupposes that he knows something has to have material form before it can have a function. In a different scenario, a home, the cabin might already be there, but a time traveling home decor team, time traveling rooms to go people come in and they decorate the place. And in this ancient Near Eastern person's mindset, the decorating rooms to go people created the home. They didn't take in this other scenario, they didn't partake in the material manufacturing, but they did assign the function. And though so they're just as much responsible for creating the home. So it could be that Job 38 is the house story and Genesis 1 is the home story. And that's actually an analogy Walton himself uses in his book. If Walton is right, you need both sides of the story to have a full account of creation. And if Walton is right, then Job 38 and Genesis 1 are just telling only half of the true story.
Yeah. Well, I interviewed Walton, and everyone make sure to check out that video. And I asked him what in if we are to see a material origins view, not something like what he says Genesis 1 is, which is more of an immaterial origins view. If we are to see a material origins question of, where did it all come from, I asked him like what that would look like, and he actually pointed me to Job. So he actually agrees here with Tsumura, where it is about material, but as you said, it's two different sides of a coin. He also gave me some other verses that were interesting there, so everyone make sure to go check that out. But the big thing there is that God and the Job story is the purpose is not some functional aspect, is to show how great God is. By accepting the existence of a pre-cosmic world, which is not a world absent of matter, in the Genesis story, Walton appears to have given up the traditional biblical doctrine of creation ex nihilo. However, his interpretation has many problems. What do you think, Evan?
I found this very ironic because Tsumura begins by complaining that Walton misrepresented him when it comes to Genesis 1 2 and Tohu Wabohu, but then he misrepresents Walton. And I put in my notes, well, I guess one misrepresentation deserves another. Walton explicitly said he affirms the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. He just thinks that support for that is found elsewhere in the Bible, elsewhere in the biblical canon. It's not in Genesis 1, but he thinks you can find it in places like John 1. And I agree. John 1 was written in a Greco-Roman context. They were, was post-Aristotle. They were concerned with material origins and where and how things came to be. At that point in history, they pretty much assumed that the gods or God created things for reasons and purposes. So they were material, or they were concerned with the how and the when and the what, right, like we are today. But also, I'm a proponent of the Kalam cosmological argument. I have several videos on it, lots of blog posts, some podcast episodes. So I affirm the doctrine of creation ex nihilo on scientific and philosophical grounds, in addition to biblical grounds. And so for me, in fact, I don't, even if I didn't have any biblical grounds, I'd still believe it on philosophical and scientific grounds, but we do have biblical grounds as well. So I have a more than enough warrant for affirming the doctrine, and John Walton explicitly made that disclaimer in his book. Look, I'm not saying creatio ex nihilo is false. That's just not what this chapter is about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Tsumura is doing it here or specifically talking about the Genesis account in regards to creation ex nihilo, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, he gets that in response a lot about like, oh, if creation ex nihilo doesn't, if creation out of nothing, if we don't get that from Genesis, like the world ends, like heretic, like terrible view, because obviously God had to create everything. But I mean, obviously Walton doesn't take that view. But not only that, but as we said, we can get that from other things than outside the Bible. Just because it's not specifically mentioned in the Bible doesn't mean that that's not how we got here, or that's not where everything came from. That's my favorite part of the paper, as he says. As the Ugaritic epithet B'nai Benwet may or may not be the correct interpretation of that. Creator of creatures for the god El suggests the ancients were certainly concerned with the material origins of the world. Though their cognitive environment and their linguistic descriptions were different from those of the moderns, the verb B'nai means to build, and its cognate terms are used for the material ontology, Genesis 2:22, and Akkadian Banu, to build, create. In other words, the ancient people assumed that materials was brought into existence by creator gods. This one was very fascinating to me. It got into, the god El, gets into the topic of the ball cycle, which is super fascinating. I mean, for one, it's worth mentioning here that, we don't actually have any creation accounts of El, so it's possible that, they didn't really even care about that much. Say that it is about material ontology, kind of like Job. It isn't terribly clear that it is like they actually cared enough to write their creation account. And I mean, with that being said, though, at the same time, we've only found about 1,500 texts in this context, so it's possible that there could be a creation account out there. If it is about material ontology, Walton already agrees with that, so that's not that big a deal.
Yeah. What Tsumura is saying here is something that Walton is well aware of. Again, in his book, he says that any people just presupposed that their god or gods were responsible for the material. That was just taken as a given. It was what's the word, axiomatic for them. But what they wanted answered, and what their creation myths address, is, well, why did God or the gods, whichever, why did Marduk, why did Baal, why did whoever, why did they make these things? What's the purpose? Why am I here? It was a teleological focus rather than a material one. And so the epithet of El, I mean, it could just mean that the creator of creatures. It just means they were the physical manufacturers, but that doesn't really tell us anything.
Yeah, sure. Well, not only that, but like this has no context, so there's different definitions of like how create is used, and then he mentions
Right. Yeah, right. You're right. Like, it could mean the assigner of all functions.
yeah, exactly. The verb he uses is it means to build, and then he uses the examples of Genesis 2:22, which Walton is fully aware of, and still concludes that it's not about material origins when he translates as side, or building a side as far as Eve. And then he also references the Akkadian Banu, to build or create. But we already know that from other texts, such as the Foundation of Eridu, where Banu is used all throughout, but we could say with pretty good confidence that they're not referring to material creation.
Those first 20 lines describe non-order. There was no temple. That's the center of order. There was no house for the gods, and all of the things that were necessary, likewise, were not in place. In that sense, those first 20 lines are very much like Genesis 1:2. The earth was formless and void, darkness on the surface of the deep. There was non-order. And then it's going to talk about how order was established. Certainly, order is established among material things. But again, Just because you're arranging the furniture doesn't mean that you're building the furniture. Yes, they would have thought that the gods created the material stuff, of course, but the material existence is not the end in itself. It's not what they're shooting for. And therefore, it really doesn't give an assessment of material origins. That's how I would view it. Obviously, people differ.
So I mean, I know it's not the exact word used, but we don't have any instances of the word bene or however you pronounce that being used as creation ex nihilo or material creation in any Ugarit text, and then any similar words. We also don't have pretty good examples of it not being about material. So I'm not sure where he gets it from. I mean, not only that, but like, and something also worth mentioning is that there's a lot of debate about whether the biocycle is actually a creation account. In the ancient Near East, in these creation accounts, we typically have the creation account, we have the conflict. Talk about like Marduk and Tiamat. With the ball cycle, you have Ba, Yam, and Mot or Mot, and then in the ball cycle, a temple is created. In the John Walton argues that in the Genesis account, you have a temple created, and sorry, I'm all over the place. And in Numeri Elish, you also have a temple created. So it seems like all three of those things go together, and for that reason, it makes sense that the ball cycle could also be seen as a creation account, but maybe a different creation account. Although there is no creation of the stars in the sky or the material or even a functional universe. At the same time, it could be seen that this conflict of bringing disorder to order, kind of like how we see in Genesis, where we go from Tahu Vavahu to functions for the cosmos. Maybe that is seen as a creation count, and if that is true, then it definitely shows that their interests as far as a creation count were very different than ours. Do you have any thoughts on that one, Evan?
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, so let's keep going. So he says, Walton's argument is mostly based on the creation myths and Genesis 1, but the mythological texts are not the only sources for the cognitive views of the ancients. Personal names, liturgical texts, pantheon lists, and archaeological findings often exhibit aspects of religion that are very different from those reflected in mythology, as is well illustrated in Ugarit. What do you think?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. Genesis 1 is a creation myth. I hold that it is a myth that is true, to use Michael Heiserian and C.S. Lewisian language. It's a divinely inspired myth. It's not a myth in the sense of a false story. It's all made up and didn't happen. It's not a synonym for an old wives' tale, but it belongs to that literary genre. It is God actually did create the universe, and it is told in this very mythological way. And so when you're doing comparative analysis, you would look at creation myths. You would look at like Enuma Elish, Atrahasis, Assyrian Carrefour, the Baal cycle, if it's a creation myth. You might want to look at it anyway, just because the Old Testament in general frequently interacts with Baal literature. But it's strange to me to think that Walton, he seems to be taking Walton to task for not looking at texts that are at different genres than Genesis. If you compare creation myths with creation myths, you don't compare a creation myth with, a liturgical. You don't compare Genesis 1 with a pantheon list or a liturgical text. That just especially if it has nothing to do with creation. I mean, you can have creation mentioned in liturgical texts, and I would also wonder, well, if the ancients, if they had like a material ontology like we do, at least predominantly. That why is that not reflected in their creation myths? Wouldn't they be interested in answering the question how their gods crafted everything? Um, I just don't find this response that good. Genesis 1 is a creation myth, so that's why Walton looks at A&E creation myths, because it's the same genre, and that can be informative.
What would you say is your best reason to think that it is a creation myth?
Well, it's because it does a lot of the same things. Like there are so many similarities, say with Enuma Elish. Like you have, well, not everybody agrees. Most Jewish scholars hold this, but a lot of Christian scholars disagree. Like I think Genesis 1 starts off as a dependent clause. You have a dependent clause, circumstantial clause, main clause, and pretty much every creation myth starts off with when blah 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 blah, when blah 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 blah, when blah 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 blah, and then you start having some creative activity. Well, there's some grammatical arguments to be made that Genesis 1:1 is not to be translated. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but when God began to create the heavens and the earth was tohu wabohu, formless and void, or a unproductive wasteland. Then God said, "Let there be light." It's very similar. If you like look at, I'd have to pull them up because I don't have these A&E creation myths how they read memorized verbatim. But you see like when there and it describes some conditions of the way things are when, and it may go 2 or 3 sentences where it says when blah 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 blah, when blah 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 blah, and then it says then we have some creative activity. I also, like I said in the previous video, I think we don't have a chaos conf, but I think we do have an allusion to one, because we have God functioning, hovering over the seas. Let me bring up some quotes from, yeah, here we go. So like let's take Enuma Elish 1:1-10, where we have it says, when in the height heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not bear a name, and the primeval Apsu who begat them, and Chaos, Tiamat, the mother of them both, their waters were mingled together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. When the gods, none had been called into being, and none bore a name, and no desires were ordained, then were created the gods in the midst of the heaven. Lamu and Lahamu were called into being. And then you have Atrahasis 1:1-8. When the gods were man, they did forced labor, they bore drudgery. Great indeed was the drudgery of the gods, the forced labor was heavy, the misery too much. The 7 great Anuna gods were burdening the Agigi gods with forced labor. So you have this kind of same structure. And then you have, I would argue, like God resting at the end of it, making the universe his temple. Those are just a couple of reasons why it is in that genre. I think Peter Enns has a good article on biologos.org, where he talks about some of Genesis's similarities to Enuma Elish. Yeah, so here we go on biologos.org. It's by Peter Enns, Genesis 1 and the Babylonian creation story. I think I will read just a few of the bullet points here. So it says, in both story, matter exists when creation begins, similar to Enuma Elish. Genesis 1 describes God ordering chaos, not creating something out of nothing. Darkness precedes the creative acts. In Enuma Elish, the symbol of chaos is the goddess Tiamat, who personifies the sea. Genesis refers to the deep. The Hebrew word is tehom, which is linguistically related to Tiamat. In both stories, light exists before the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. In both stories, there is a division of the waters above and below, with a barrier holding back the upper waters. And if you're, for the viewers interested, they can just Google Peter Enns Genesis 1 Enuma Elish in the search engine, put in the keywords, and that's what I put in to find it. Genesis Enuma Elish, and yeah, that's how I find it. But those are some reasons to think Genesis 1 is a creation myth, like Enuma Elish and some of the others.
Yeah, and that's just one Christian myth in general. So you have all
Yeah.
these other different elements with other places. I mean, I think an obvious one is the mention of the sea monsters in Genesis 5, which is a lot different than the other ones in regards to the sea, not the great sea creatures. They are already in submission to God. Like there's no divine conflict at the very beginning. So while it is different, it is still does that have that mention of these mythical creatures, which is what they're obviously going to think of, like at the very as soon as they see that, like, oh my goodness, this sea creatures, what, there's no conflict, that's weird. When you look at this, so to say that it's I think it's very clear, to almost all scholars, that it's directly in the context of a creation account. Maybe even a myth, but not necessarily the non-historical type of myth. So let's keep going then. Walton holds that the cosmos should be understood in temple terms, just as the temple in ancient Near East is variously equated with the cosmos. Similarly, the cosmology of Genesis 1 is built on the platform of temple theology. Both of these ideas, rest and the garden, are integral to the temple theology of the ancient world. Walton seems to agree that the cosmos and temple are homologous. He holds that in Genesis, the entire cosmos can be portrayed as a temple because the cosmos and temple serve the same functions. However, one still needs to consider the possibility that this use of language is metaphorical, since the ancient Near Eastern poets sometimes described the building of a temple using cosmic metaphors. The narrator of Genesis 1 could have used a temple metaphor to describe the cosmos, but there's no reason to think he did, because the Hebrew word normally means to cease, not to rest. Certainly, texts like Isaiah 66:1, I do not suggest that God dwells within the cosmos as his temple. I hope to discuss this theme more thoroughly in a separate article.
So I'm not sure what Tsumura is trying to gain by saying that the cosmos in temple descriptions of the cosmos in temple terms are metaphorical. Yes, that if in fact the fact that temples were often used with describing cosmic imagery is actually an argument that proponents of the temple inauguration view, like Walton himself, but also Ben Stanhope, J. Richard Middleton, they used in favor of the cosmic temple view. It was like as Walton says, they viewed the man-made temple in Jerusalem as like a microcosm of the cosmos. It was like a little mini universe. And yes, it was obviously metaphorical because the temple is not a universe, but the universe is not a temple in the same sense like the Jerusalem temple is. It's not, but the temple is like essentially a dwelling place for Yahweh. But also, when you consider the three-tiered dome structure that the ancient Israelites held, they would have seen. Yes, you have it in the background there. They would have seen. Okay, like the first heaven, that was where the clouds were. That was where the birds flew. The second heaven was where the cosmic waters were. By the way, they believe that the sun, moon, and stars were under the dome as well. And then when you went above the dome, you had the cosmic waters, which was the source of rain. And if you keep going farther up, eventually you get to the throne room of Yahweh. That was the third heaven. So I'm not like, okay, yeah, it's metaphorical language. It's still a temple. But a puzzling appeal to metaphor aside, I find Tsumura's dealing with the word Sabbat to be quite strained. Yeah, it often does mean to just stop what you're doing. For example, in Lamentations 5:14, we read, "The elders have gone from city to city; the young men have stopped (sabbat) their music." And in Genesis 8:22, we read, "While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease (sabbat). And there's lots of examples like this. However, again, context determines the meaning of words. And in the context of work and observation of the Sabbath, the idea of rest is clearly implied. One normally ceases from one's work because one is tired and needs rest. Now, of course, this isn't the case for God because he's omnipotent. He never runs out of energy. Um, but Exodus 20:11 says, hey, God worked for 6 days and took a break, stopped on the seventh. So you're supposed to do that too. Do your work on 6 days and then rest on the seventh. It just seems to me like he's making much out of nothing. And again, it seems to be that kind of word buffet fallacy that I mentioned. I think it was in the previous video that Walton brings up when he's criticizing the day age proponents, where you have a Hebrew word and it has like 2 or 3 different definitions, and in order to support your view, you pick the one that most corresponds to your view, rather than paying attention to what the context indicates the definition is. Well, in the context of the creation days, I mean, Exodus says there's a work rest association there. Now, with Isaiah 66:1, first let me read the verse. It says, quote, "This is what the Lord says, heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool," end quote. Tsumura says that this verse doesn't support the view that the biblical authors saw the cosmos as the temple that God dwelled in. He doesn't give any reasons as to why he thinks that, so it doesn't give me much to respond to. He said he was going to address it in a separate article. I do wish he would have gotten into it here, because it's puzzling to me how this doesn't support the temple view. Again, remember how the ancient Israelites viewed the cosmos. 3-tiered, 3-heaven structure. Dome covered the flat disk earth. Land sat on cosmic waters where the dangerous Leviathan lurked deep beneath, near the bottom of the abysmal waters. And the dome covered the flat earth, and it had cosmic waters up there. The dome had windows that opened and closed to let rain in occasionally. That's why, it opened and then it would close. That's why it started raining, and that's why it stopped raining. And this was the first and second heaven. So let's say that the Doctor from Doctor Who shows up in his TARDIS, a time traveling, space traveling machine that's bigger on the inside than the outside, and he picks up an ancient Near Eastern Jew to be his most recent traveling companion. So they start to go upward. Now, this is what the Doctor's companion would expect. He would expect that, okay, we're going to go up. How are we going to get past a solid dome? Well, maybe we'll just slip through one of the windows as it opens to let rain in, and then we'll go up through the water. We'll keep going up, and then we'll be at the very top. We'll be in God's throne room. Now, of course, in the modern day, we rightly know that heaven is not up anywhere. You could go 3 million light years in that direction, and you'll never get to God's throne room. Heaven, where Yahweh, the divine council, deceased humans awaiting the resurrection live, that's, for lack of a better term, in another dimension, in another realm. It's kind of akin to the Soul Society in the Bleach manga series. It's something that occupies a different realm, not the top of the universe. But they didn't know that. But we still talk of heaven being up, like, someone might say, Evan's mom is up there partying with Jesus, because the biblical imagery is so ingrained in our thinking. So this is all set up for the point I'm about to make. When God says, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool, when the Israelites heard that, they would have understood this as God's dwelling place beginning in the highest heaven, the third heaven, and extending all the way down to the dirt where we live. And it's more metaphorical language, obviously. They don't see Yahweh as like the colossal titan just sitting on a big throne. And like if you were traveling with a horse or donkey, you would just run into giant feet in the middle of the road somewhere. No, it's clearly metaphorical, but the metaphor is that the universe is God's dwelling place. He sits on top. He kicks back his feet, and like this is where he is chilling out, so to speak. So interpreting heaven and earth with the A&E mindset, heaven was, not thinking of heaven in modern evangelical terms. The temple theology is very explicit. One point that I might make in addition is that Jesus continued this when he's talking in the Sermon on the Mount, which I'm going to be doing a series on soon on my channel, on the live web show. Matthew chapter 5 verse 34 to 35, he says, quote, "But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king," end quote. And then he goes on to say, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." And he's referring to this Isaiah verse. God's throne, it's on the heaven. The earth is his footstool. That cosmic dome thing, that's where God dwells.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning that when he talks about a metaphor, almost like it kind of disagrees with Walton's view. Yeah, I don't necessarily see that. Like, you can still have truths assigned to a metaphor. Yeah, I would say that kind of like how Genesis 1 is often seen as God is creating, and then on the seventh day he rests, and just like that, we should rest. But a view that maybe many people haven't heard, that I talk with Christy Hemphill on my channel, is that creation, Genesis 1 can be seen as a creation week. God is setting up the cosmos. He's doing things, kind of like a cosmic gardener. Each single day he's going in, he's decreeing, he's making things, he's separating, he's naming, he's evaluating these results, delegating responsibilities, commanding, and then providing resources. And and they're mapped onto God and him creating his creation week, which doesn't say that it isn't literal 7 days, but it does say that the text can have additional meaning, as God is the provider. He is the cosmic gardener of the world, essentially. Something to look into. But yeah, so that's about it there, Evan. That's all I got. It's been fun talking to you. You guys can go check out Evan at his website. What is the link there for you?
www.cerebralfaith.net. And you
Cool.
can also find all my videos are on my website, but they're also on the channel if you'd like to subscribe and turn on notifications for when I have new material coming out. That's where you would do it. Just type in Cerebral Faith Video into the YouTube search engine.
Yeah, and we'll have a link in the description as well if you want to check it out. Definitely make sure to go to subscribe. It's been fun talking to you, Evan. I'll make sure everyone else, if you haven't watched, go watch our other videos together, as we'll be talking to. We're going to be going through other scholarly criticism of Walton's views of immaterial origins. So definitely make sure to go check out those as well. Hope you guys have a great day, and it's been fun talking to you, Evan.
Fun talking to you too, and keep using the brains that God gave you.
Amen.